This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Hey, you want to hear something crazy?
Always.
So I've just moved to DC, and I'm trying to establish residence in my new home.
Leaving Maryland behind.
Leaving Maryland, yes.
The distant lands of Maryland for DC.
Yeah, I think I could, well, I couldn't, but Aaron Rodgers from 2010 could throw a football into Maryland from here.
Okay.
I'm probably exaggerating. I actually have no idea. One problem with my DC life is I don't know anywhere besides the path between work and home. Whether home is at Catholic University of America as it is during the summers, or now a neighborhood I will not mention. But I'm trying to establish residency so I can park on the street and not arrive home and have dozens of pink tickets on my car amounting to hundreds of dollars. But it's not the easiest thing in the world to establish residency in DC. You have to get on the lease, and that can take a little while, or an electrical bill or utility bill or something. You know how it works. But one of the forms of documentation the DMV takes to be able to establish residency is a voter ID card. Now, you would think that you would need to establish residency before you get a voter ID. Sorry, not even a voter ID card, just a letter confirming my registration. But you can actually use your voter registration, which you do not need established residency to get, as documentation of residency for your confirmation of residency. You'd think that would be the other way around, but no, I can vote before I can park.
We're jealous guardians of their streets than they are of their streets. Well, congratulations on the decisions you've made in your life.
Thank
Mr.
you. I hope
Slutkin.
they're good ones.
That's good. At least you know you have a Terry keeping you safe nowadays. And that's something we're going to discuss today as we discuss Federalist Papers 28 and 29. 23 got the ball rolling here, the necessity of a government at least equally energetic with the one proposed. And we see the papers that follow, 24 through 29, continuing that subject. We have titles such as "The Subject Continued with an Answer to an Objection Concerning Standing Armies." That's 24. 25, "The Subject Continued with the Same View." 26, "The Subject Continued with the Same View." 27, "The Subject Continued with the Same View." And 28, which we're taking up today, "The Same Subject Continued." And then finally 29, "Concerning the Militia." 24 through 29 are on the military in one way or another. And we see that it's such a grave matter that so many papers are devoted to it. My thinking is very simple on this. Whenever you see someone taking up an argument over and over and over again, that person is admitting the strength of the prejudice against that argument. This is simple ends, means, proportional thinking that Publius has introduced us to in Federalist Paper number 23. If you remember in 23, Publius says the powers must be proportionate to the end. You must have the actual energy inside of government to own up to its ends. So you must give government the power to act according to those ends. Okay, so that ends means thinking and that need for proportion, I'm now trying to lay over the fact that Publius spends so many papers on the establishment of a standing army, and then even on the militia, to say he judges such an energetic argument, if I may use those words, necessary because of the countervailing prejudices. And this is something we should have said earlier, Aaron. Yeah, I still have a bad feeling because of some bums with funny accents, which I happen to have myself, nonetheless making me billet troops in my home. And we kind of should have brought that up as a live thing. I mean, you now in DC are around a National Guard. And these guys, I trust, Aaron, are armed, right? I mean, they have M16s and they're driving around in Humvees or whatever sort of gun they have now, M4A1s, whatever it is.
Yeah, they're everywhere. I mean, yesterday I ran from Capitol Hill down past the Capitol, the Washington Monument, down to Lincoln Memorial, and past maybe 50 guys and girls. They're everywhere.
but armed with
military-grade weapons.
military-grade weapons, yes. And look, I experienced this after Hurricane Katrina. Forgive me if I said this already, but I was sitting in PJ's Coffee on Magazine Street in New Orleans writing a paper on Aristotle over the summer, of course, late, turning it late, and out of the corner of my eye, just see a weapon, a perfectly nice dude buying coffee for himself and his boys in the Humvee that's sitting right outside. This is different. And I've grown up around guns. I don't feel ill at ease around guns, but that is a different feeling. So if you and I can admit that this feels different, imagine what it is if you had to billet troops. Imagine if you still smell all of that gunpowder that was around during the Revolutionary War and the power of those British troops that were everywhere in New England and so on and so forth. So these arguments are ones that are especially powerful, I think, because of the immediate context. And I now want to say you and I can, from my experience in New Orleans and your experience in DC, see their power. And even if we didn't have that immediate experience, I would hope that our ability to reflect would show us the importance of these considerations. No matter our material experience of these things, our knowledge of human affairs, of power, violence, tyranny, along with our love of liberty, would find us taking the arguments in these Federalist Papers very seriously.
Yeah, and beyond the historical context, which the generation that ratified the Constitution, that engaged in this debate, and that we now share, there is, of course, the immediate importance of the issue of a standing army to Republican politics generally. From their English political ancestry, from their shared history, right? They remembered, even if they didn't actually remember it, but it was in their memory, Cromwell. It's in their memory, of course, the kingly standing armies of the period before Republican politics really became dominant in England. And so this was a political inheritance that you can see Publius in bringing up the Republican opposition to standing armies and the Republican, let's say, almost veneration for the militia, not just the militia in practice that they might think won them the revolution, but the militia in theory. So this is really important ground, as you note, and you not only have the historical example pointing to the urgency of writing several papers about this, but also if you are going to have a republic, then in the American mind, that means also having a militia and having within the polity a very significant distrust of standing armies. So it requires, when you're going to link federal authority to arms, when you are going to have a provision for raising an army, and when you're going to put the power for regulating the militia into the hands of the national government, it requires a lot of buttressing of the argument and of the Constitution to resist not only the prejudice of the people, but also the artifice of the anti-federalists.
We've seen Publius trying to build that confidence and trust in his audience thus far. And in the beginning of 28, Publius says something in a parenthetical that's worth pointing out in light of your remarks just there, Aaron. He says in a parenthetical in the first paragraph of Federalist Paper number 28, certain people think that the only admissible principle of Republican government is law voluntarily obeyed. I don't know if that's how you interpret that sentence. It's a bit challenging to understand, but Publius there considers the idea of governing at all times by the simple force of law has no place but in the reverie of those political doctors. So there are these bad doctors out there whose sagacity disdains the admonitions of experimental instruction, who think that it's possible to have government that doesn't actually have force at its disposal, violence at its disposal. These doctors think that Republican government is incompatible with the law backed by violence or force. Publius has to correct that mistaken notion. So he's taking this distrust of military forces to an extreme. Something I've said several times recently, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Why? Look at the diagnosis that the Dr. Publius offers us in paragraph 1. I'll read it if you don't mind, Aaron. This is Federalist Paper number 28, the first paragraph. That there may happen cases in which the national government may be under the necessity of resorting to force cannot be denied. Our own experience has corroborated the lessons taught by the examples of other nations that emergencies of this sort will sometimes exist in all societies, however constituted. That seditions and insurrections are, unhappily, maladies as inseparable from the body politic as tumors and eruptions from the natural body. That the idea of governing at all times by the simple force of law, which we have been told is the only admissible principle of republican government, has no place but in the reverie of those political doctors whose sagacity disdains the admonitions of experimental instruction. The malady of sedition and insurrection is as natural as are tumors and eruptions to the body. All political societies, no matter how constituted, will suffer sedition and insurrection. It's as if it's sown into the very nature of man, not to be solved by technical means such as this regime or that regime, a republic versus a monarchy. No, the solution to this is a seemingly natural solution. Violence will be needed to put down sedition and insurrection. And I would also say now, since you see you can't solve this by regime type or by a particular political education, that means this problem plagues just and unjust regimes alike. No matter the justice or injustice of your laws, this is going to happen. People never smoked a day in their life get cancer. People who smoke all their lives don't get cancer. This stuff just happens, these tumors. So it rains on the just and the unjust alike. Bring an umbrella. Take your military seriously, Publius is here saying. What do you think of paragraph 1, Aaron?
Well, I think it's important to ask why it is that people who would endorse Republican government would think that its only admissible principle is governing at all times by the simple force of law. And there I think he's in some ways playing on the term force. Republican government requires consent of the governed. Coercion requires consent to be legitimate. And you would think, if you took the anti-federalist viewpoint, that the law that the people made would bind the people because they had made it, because they keep their word, because they're not going to contravene something that they made for themselves and for all people after they've done so. That the force that would back up the law would be the force of what? Goodwill? Goodwill's a force sometimes, but when it's not present, when the force doesn't operate, then you need something else. And that something else is another kind of force. The force we're talking about in this paper and the next and the previous ones is the way that we understand when we use the term force.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to imagine that the anti-federalists would think that force wouldn't be necessary to uphold the law. And later we're going to get mention of a provision for posse comitatus. We'll talk about that then. I have a feeling Publius is sort of hiding the idea that the anti-federalists do believe that you need certain kinds of force to uphold the law, that you do need officers who are in charge of enforcement, and that they need arms and they also need the power to raise together citizens for the purpose of enforcing the law and putting down the bad guys. But all of a sudden, by use of this word force in different ways, especially given the context of the previous papers, we come to think that even if certain kinds of subordinate forces, auxiliary forces, are useful in enforcing the law, when he says force, we automatically think military force, whether embodied in the militia or in the armies that Congress can raise. So the rhetoric here points us toward the use of a large, dangerous, well-armed, well-funded, 2-year, at least enduring, force that we now will, pretty much from the first paragraph, accept it's necessary. So it's remarkable the way in which Publius can get us using the same vocabulary as he is, using different definitions of the same word, but getting us to accept them.
Yeah, our favorite one of late is his use of impolitic.
Right.
And it's interesting because in this opening paragraph, in this parenthetical, he speaks of the force of law. But the concern here are seditions and insurrections. Mere ordinary law breaking is some of the stuff I was thinking about as you and I have been talking today. What it takes to even make people obey the speed limit, for instance. But that would be something like a common cold in comparison with the tumors and eruptions that he's speaking of. He's got seditions and insurrections on his mind. But I think all the same, the need for the law to be backed by force exists no matter if it's the speed limit that must be obeyed or the general order of government, which must persist. And that's what's here at issue. America herself, all of that beautiful stuff from Federalist Paper number 2 from a lifetime ago is not sufficient. And no matter the brilliance of Publius's machine, that alone is not sufficient. We can deal with majority faction by way of enlarged orbit, by way of representative government, but even that's not going to keep insurrection and sedition at bay. We will need good old-fashioned violence for that. Notice the density of the word rights in this paper, 28. By my quick count, he says rights something like 3 times. He's very conscious of what's at stake here, liberty and rights. That's what's at issue. Government is to secure us in our liberties, and liberty is a fundamental natural right, of course, and it needs to have the ability to compel bad people who want to deprive us of that liberty. But at the same time, we are very much concerned that those bad people could be occupants of the stations of government itself, who could then rob us of our very liberty. That's the simple tension. As I've said in our past meetings, we need a dog to keep us safe, but we don't want that dog to bite us, become a bad dog. That's just as a quick reminder of the tension that's at issue here.
In the second paragraph, I think we get a formulation, a proposition maybe, that we've heard before, that if we accept it as the hinge on which the entire paper's argument rests. And that is, should such emergencies at any time happen under the national government, which we've already accepted from the first paragraph as inevitable, there could be no remedy but force. And we'll start in the third paragraph with an insurrection in a whole state, and then we'll shrink and grow and shrink as it goes on. But if we accept that point, Mike, that the means must be proportioned to the extent of the mischief, then Publius says we have to recognize the necessity of a greater force than a militia to be able to suppress insurrection.
Do you see how this fits with the logic? Of course, the means ends thinking and the need for proportionality fits with Federalist Paper 23. But how in the turn to the problems of seditions and insurrections, Publius is helping us think through one of those exigencies we will face. All of those exigencies with which we were concerned in Federalist Paper number 23 that showed us the need for these powers to exist without limit inside the government. We're now getting specifics because who knows exactly what the sedition is going to be, but we need to have a militia to handle this on the state level. And even then, if it's not merely in some corner of some state, once it gets bigger, we're going to need a standing army. Well, how exactly are you going to deploy it? What exactly is it going to do? I need the power to direct it as I see fit in the case of that emergency. But here is some such emergency that I'm now trying to show you to facilitate your buy-in to the arguments that began with Federalist 23. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, I think so. And if we read on, look, why is this? An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, eventually endangers all government. Hold on, why do you think that is? An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, even if it's in Western Massachusetts, it endangers all government?
Even if its cause be just or unjust? If it's in Nowheresville, Western Massachusetts? Why? Is it because it's a tumor that's going to spread throughout the whole body? Are you thinking of the problems of lawlessness and mob rule in Lincoln's Lyceum address? You of course recall Lincoln's account there, but you could use the natural image of the decay of the body riddled with tumors that he invited. Sorry to be so gross, but that's what he invited us to consider in paragraph 1. As Lincoln shows us in the Lyceum address, once you start to have some mob rule, all of those people who are lawless in spirit are going to jump at the opportunity. Hey, now's the time to get a robin. And then in addition, those people who are law-abiding are going to lose complete faith in the government because the government is proving weak, feckless, impotent. And they're going to turn to a strong man of a certain tribe and a certain family who's going to promise them relief. And then there's the loss of liberty. So that's just me riffing on good old Lincoln, our dearest friend, and also just thinking through the image of a body that has tumors. What do you think? You think I'm off base?
No, let's
or is
carry
that
it forward and think about how we can make the body healthful and resistant to
Yeah.
insurrection.
Go ahead, Dr. Slutkin.
Regard to the public peace, if not to the rights of the Union, would engage the citizens to whom the contagion had not communicated itself to oppose the insurgents. There are your antibodies. I guess you can't have antibodies for cancer. There are your white blood cells. And if the general government should be found in practice conducive to the prosperity and felicity of the people, it were irrational to believe that they would be disinclined to its support. So you can arm the body against these kinds of cancers, but you cannot think that you can ever eradicate them. As you said, in people who do not smoke and smoke, some will not get cancer. So there are ways in which you can make the body resistant to these tumors, these insurrections. But at the very end, even if the body is resistant, you still need a means for cutting it out.
If this sedition or insurrection is just in some little corner of a state, the militia should be able to take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, we should see the danger. It must be taken care of. Because Publius allows us to consider that such things will not stay hidden in a little corner for long. You better act. The militia is sufficient here. But if the sedition or insurrection occurs inside of a state at large, the militia is not sufficient. Different kind of force might become unavoidable, he says. And then he looks at the way that the states themselves have behaved. This is paragraph 3. In a whole state or a principal part of it, he turns to Massachusetts, which found it necessary to raise troops for suppressing the disorders within that state. Pennsylvania just had the mere apprehension of commotion and took recourse to the same measure. This is such a serious deal that Publius offers us a very important axiom, I would say, that issues from these premises. Middle of paragraph 3. If it must then be admitted that the necessity of recurring to a force different from the militia in cases of this extraordinary nature is applicable to the state governments themselves, why should the possibility that the national government might be under a like necessity in similar extremes be made an objection to its existence? In the cases of this extraordinary nature, Publius says there, that's what we've been talking about since Federalist Paper number 23. And we have to realize that these cases of extraordinary nature occur all too often. That's an essential component of Publius's political science. He's the child of someone else we've spoken of several times in this regard. You have to build the dikes and dams and realize that you are preparing for the extraordinary, because in the long course of things, it becomes quite ordinary. Just as ordinary as disease affecting a human body, disease shall affect your body politic at some point or another.
And he carries the example forward. Now we've talked about a whole state. Let's say we don't get this constitution. The anti-federalists win. The Union, Publius has argued before, will be broken up into 3 or 4 confederacies, and the anti-federalists themselves have entertained this. The principle will still apply, because a insurrection in one of the smaller confederacies will still require a military force different than the militia in order to put it down. However America is organized, whether you have a number of confederacies, whether you have states, whether you have a national government administrating over the entire nation, a military force will be necessary. And he's established this only in the first 4 paragraphs. And let me just read quickly. All candid and intelligent men must, upon due consideration, acknowledge that the principle of the objection is equally applicable to either of the 2 cases, that is, one national government or multiple confederacies. There might sometimes be a necessity to make use of a force constituted differently from the militia to preserve the peace of the community and to maintain the just authority of the laws against those violent invasions of them which amount to insurrections and rebellions. So however way you slice it, you still need this force.
There's a difference, though, between Massachusetts raising troops to suppress a disorder and a standing national military. And the question I want to ask is the necessity of having a standing national military because of widespread insurrection and sedition, a disadvantage of the enlarged sphere. the increased orbit of government. So we have this bigger union. And so then this is going to be a matter of national emergency regarding national laws. And so we need a standing army. So is that then a disadvantage of the enlarged orbit of government that was such an advantage back in Fed 10? I see Publius is anticipating my question by what he says at the end of paragraph 3. He says, "Is it not surprising that men who declare an attachment to the Union in the abstract should urge as an objection to the proposed Constitution what applies with tenfold weight to the plan for which they contend, and what, as far as it has any foundation in truth, is an inevitable consequence of civil society upon an enlarged scale? Who would not prefer that possibility to the unceasing agitations and frequent revolutions which are the continual scourges of petty republics?" One of the reasons we so admire the enlarged sphere is that it escapes the motion of those petty republics of antiquity. And so that is sitting back there as the alternative. Sure, this enlarged sphere necessitates a standing army. All the more, what do you want to do? Go back to those problems of the petty republics of antiquity? What do you want to do? Go back to a series of smaller confederacies which border each other? Remember all of the work we did in the single-digit papers outlining all of the challenges that would pose for security and stability in our liberty? Sure, there is a danger here. Publius admits that there's a danger here, but he wants us to understand that the true danger is not having this standing army.
Yeah, we readers who have been engaged in this project for a while will recall the language from Federalist 9. So we've come to accept the proposition that the means must be proportionate to the end. He's been working that on us for a while. We've just come to accept that we're not willing to trade a small republic for a bigger one, a petty one for one within a large sphere. Where are we going now? Because the paper doesn't end. We would think that the original objection has in some ways been answered. So what does he do now, Mike?
He shifts in paragraph 4 to say, let's think about the examination in another light when he speaks of 2 or 3 or 4 confederacies to show that the problem will be there as well. And then after this, in paragraphs 5 and following, he turns to reminding us of the fact that the legislature is to have control over the existence and persistence of this army, still quiet on the executive directing it. But nonetheless, he says in paragraph 5 of Federalist 28, independent of all reasonings upon the subject, it is a full answer to those who require a more peremptory provision against the military establishments in time of peace to say that the whole power of the proposed government is to be in the hands of the representatives of the people. This is the essential and, after all, the only efficacious security for the rights and privileges of the people, which is attainable in civil society. And then in the 6th paragraph, Publius reminds us of our responsibility to ourselves. So the representatives are responsible to us and for us. And then he reminds us of our own responsibility to ourselves in the 6th paragraph. If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, there is then no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which, against the usurpation of the national rulers, may be exerted with an infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the rulers of an individual state. So Publius is now going to show us how, if we have to take up our right to revolution, if we must bear arms against a tyrannical government, we will have a better go of it against a national government than we will a state government. But before we outline that argument, I would at least like to say, here is the origin of another take on the necessity of the Second Amendment. It's not merely for a well-regulated militia, but it's for a well-regulated militia in the states over against a tyrannical federal government. Here in Federalist Paper number 28, and I think in 29, the 6th paragraph of Federalist Papers 28 and 29 should have their readers thinking about this. He's saying, yeah, take up the sword, make an appeal to heaven. This is Publius's argument, by the way. I'm just reading the book and talking about it. If anyone wants to say, oh, you're a crazy person, maybe I'm crazy for reading the book and taking it seriously, but that's all I'm doing right now. Aaron's smiling. You can't see it because this is just audio, but Aaron's smiling and nodding. because he thinks I'm crazy, I guess.
Well, I would just note that in this paper that has talked about the danger of insurrections, we realize that Publius is not an enemy of insurrection.
But it's not, this is a great point you make, and I really appreciate that point, but it's not an insurrection in this point, because an insurrection would be something like a rebellion. But the origin of this thinking, as far as I know, from Locke's second treatise, chapter 19, has us understanding that the true rebels are actually the government which has violated the trust that the people have placed in it. So we're not the rebels. We're not the insurrectionists. They are. And this offers us the moral justification that accompanies the law of nature that requires us to preserve ourselves.
Earlier, we entertained in paragraph 2 the idea that an insurrection can have a just cause. Are we thinking here in paragraph 6 that we've raised the terms of the emergency, the threat to our liberties, the long train of abuses is so grave that we no longer would call it an insurrection, but we would recognize that there are insurrections we would recognize that there are just causes which fall under the category of insurrections. Here, we're talking about something so grave that it's a different category altogether.
Yeah. Back there, we were thinking about it from the government's perspective for maintaining its law. And now, if I can continue just to sing the song of John Locke, we're thinking about it as each individual citizen's need to preserve the law of nature whenever the government has violated the trust that the constituents have placed in it. We're back from a little technical difficulty there. The Google Fiber at Aaron's fancy pants new place didn't seem to hold up to the strength of our arguments, or Publius's arguments, I guess I should say. So we're back, sorry, a little bit disjointed over here. Picking up, though, in paragraph 6 of Federalist Paper number 28, we have to keep in mind that the people should have some trust in the military establishment because it's the representatives of the people who are running the thing. And then if not, you have your original right to self-defense. The original right to self-defense is paramount to all positive forms of government. But what's neat about this is Publius goes on to say, the states will come in handy in inhibiting the power of an unjust government. It will be more difficult for people inside of states to act in concert against that state government than it will for the people in states to come together and act in concert against the federal government if the federal government proves tyrannical in some way or unjust in some way that's serious enough to warrant doing so. Both the natural strength of the people and the artificial power of the county and state governments should prove a barrier to any tyrannical impulses that might overtake the national government, and also a rallying point for the people in case the federal government does have such ambitions. Therefore, we increase resistance against the possibility of tyrannical government coming about, and also the ability of it to act according to its motives if it does come about from below. Sort of grassroots stuff here. So again, I started off this paragraph by talking about the Second Amendment is not merely about a well-regulated militia in the abstract. Here we can see, even though the Second Amendment's going to come later, here we can see the thoughts behind that might have been shared at the time in a very matter-of-fact manner. So this is federalism yet again proving a bulwark against tyranny.
Yeah. Yeah, we're getting an anticipation of the double security from Federalist 51. Let me read.
Where are you?
Paragraph number 7. The obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the state, providing the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. The natural strength of the people in a large community, in proportion to the artificial strength of the government, is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to a struggle with the attempts of the government to establish a tyranny. But in a confederacy of the people, without exaggeration, may be said to be entirely the masters of their own fate, power being almost always the rival of power. The general government will at all times stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition toward the general government. So lest we come to fear, Mike, our state governments from paragraph 6 will realize that they work, as you said, a mutual check upon the other. And we might come to fear the extended sphere from paragraphs 3 and 2, no, the extended sphere will make it easier to resist a tyranny. As he says, our experience in the late war showed. So in paragraph 8, he begins, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. And compare that again to the axiom that we got in paragraph 2, that the means must be proportionate to the ends. That was an axiom of all government. This is an axiom of our particular government, a well-constructed government. These well-constructed governments construct well good axioms. And so it's pointing to the importance of a good constitution that not only recognizes political necessity, as expressed by the means must be proportionate to the ends, which we learned in 23, but also a good constitution must take into account things like the extent of land, the character of the people, for example, one, understanding their rights and disposed to defend them. And so this constitution making really takes into account the material here, the human material, the geographic material, and also takes into account natural laws governing political society.
Good administration, or a government well administered, is all the more important to keep in mind here, it seems to me, because the overall point of Fed 28, it seems, is to show the reader that the federal government can be strong and have a standing army, and the states can check it, even though the chances for needing this should be little, because the federal government, in order to win our love for it, allegiance to it, will need to be just, and it will need to be beneficial to us. In short, it will need to be well administered. So if it's doing its job well, the standing army should be there simply for those occasional tumors and eruptions that are bound to come up, to say nothing of external threats. So it's to keep us safe from enemies foreign and domestic. And that's why we need it. But if it's doing its job well, if the federal system, in terms of federalism, is working well, then those enemies domestic should not be the federal government. But what if they are? What are we going to do? Publius has shown us the ways in which we can safeguard and act against that throughout Fed 28.
Yeah, and he raises a possibility that deals with the dual nature of federal authority, that it is at the same time federal and constituted of people from the states. Mike, I found this interesting. This is from paragraph 8. It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. Projects of usurpation cannot be masked under pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large. The legislatures will have better means of information. They can discover the danger at a distance, and possessing all the organs of civil power and the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. We would think about where such a conspiracy would emanate from, and we would think it's in the national councils, themselves composed of people from the states. So even the national government itself provides a means resisting federal tyranny, because it's composed of the members of the states who, remember, are sent from the select bodies that are going to provide the alarm bells against tyranny. So the move of composing the national government of representatives from the states, especially the upper chamber being comprised of appointees, at least then, from the state legislature, we see how we provide even another security against tyranny and conspiracy. And then, of course, when push comes to shove, we learn in paragraph 9, the great extent of the country will provide further security as the lessons of the revolution taught. He says, if the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would be able to make head with fresh forces. You can subdue New Jersey, but they'll gather in New York or South Carolina, a lesson borne out not only by the revolution, but the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get a different argument in paragraph 10 that reminds us, if the time comes when the country has grown to such an extent that the national government is able to raise an army to put down the liberties of the citizens, well, because the national army can only really grow in proportion to the citizen body will be too numerous to allow such a thing to happen, which I think reminds us overall of the importance that you cannot have a force that really is separate from the main body of the people. Because the main body of the people need to be able to defend themselves from possible tyranny. They need to be a match against an army wanting to deprive them of their liberty. I don't think that means that they need to have the same technology, because they have other advantages, like the state governments, which might provide for them, and they have advantages like the great extent of the country. But you do need to have people who are, as we got in an earlier paragraph, knowledgeable of their rights and willing to defend them. And I think he's imagining that the force, the specialized force, will be constituted from the great body of the people. And that's a really, really important security against tyranny.
It's interesting. There's one of my favorite bits that we've read thus far in our time together is in Federalist Paper 15. Publius is talking about human beings' concern for reputation and how that so much shapes our behavior as individuals. And the danger that he was considering there is that as we come together in groups, that concern over reputation dwindles, and people therefore find a sort of aptitude towards forming factions and ease in forming factions. And, my favorite example, it's a lot easier to say, hey, let's throw this trash can through this plate glass window whenever you're in a large group of people with a certain energy about them than it is just you having that same energy about you, but being alone. And we wrestled with that back in Federalist Paper number 15. Here, I think Publius has flipped that upside down. Look, it's very clear. Human beings individually are governable. They're docile, perhaps too much so. But what about human beings in groups? That's the challenge. Human beings in groups have a sort of spirit that can breed faction back there in 15. But here, that human beings in groups finds them possessing the spirit needed for good government, possessing the spirit capable of checking a tyrannical federal government, and even a pocket or group of insurrectionists and or seditionists that may appear in their state, as that group of people would form a militia. Here, us coming together as groups possessing certain qualities seem to be essential for keeping the government good. And those qualities we have to have, therefore, are some live concern over our rights, over the public liberty. And I'm saying rights and privileges and rights and public liberty because Publius uses precisely that language throughout Federalist Paper number 28. A lovely little paper. It's got some passages that are quite challenging to understand. You've helped me and helped us, I think, with the way you were parsing out force and Publius's fun use of the word force. The rhetorical questions, I think, are quite challenging at times, and I would just suggest readers give it a couple of goes, perhaps read it out loud. For instance, in paragraph 3, when he says, "Is it not surprising that men who declare attachment to the Union in the abstract should urge as," and he just keeps piling clauses on. I'm not going to make you hear me read it again. We've already read it. But I think just read through them, try and state it the other way. He is saying it is surprising that they're doing this. It's a fun paper with some challenging bits, a beautiful concluding sentence, I would say. The apprehension that would lie in anyone, let alone the objectors, that the federal army would grow so big as to just dominate us, he says, the apprehension may be considered as a disease for which there can be found no cure in the resources of argument and reasoning. Because he's offered reasonings and arguments which he thinks should cure us of our apprehensions about the various military forces needed to cure the tumors and eruptions that are the insurrections and seditions that are bound to happen. So he's cured us of that. Those who aren't cured can't be reasoned with, refuse to listen to argument. Is it okay to turn to 29 now, Aaron?
Yeah, let's do it.
The title of Federalist Paper number 29 is Concerning the Militia. It's a lovely little paper, and it's the importance of having a well-regulated militia. This stems, of course, from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 of the United States Constitution.
Well, Interesting that he buries the reading of that clause until the end of the second paragraph. So first, we get the power of regulating the militia and of commanding its services in times of insurrection and invasion are natural incidents to the duties of superintending the common defense and of watching over the internal peace of the Confederacy. Now, it requires, he says in the second paragraph, no skill in the science of war to discern that uniformity in the organization and discipline of the militia would be attended with the most beneficial effects whenever they were called into service for the public defense. So we want uniformity and discipline. Where is that likely to come from? It can be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. And so we learn that if we didn't already read the proposed constitution, that power is vested in the federal government. Quote, the Union is to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. Here we are emphasized, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So this is one of the few papers where we don't begin with an objection. We begin with a statement, an argument that the things that are to be desired from the militia are best accounted for in the federal government. We then read the provision, and Publius does not quote the Constitution very often, certainly not as often as his opponents do. And then we get the objection. So the structure of this paper is unusual, given our experience. And what is that objection?
Well, if I can just try an elevator speech, the objection is as simple as this. The anti-federalists object to a standing army and also object to the ability of Congress to organize and regulate well the militia. So they want neither power to exist in the federal government. What is the federal government to do, therefore, is the question you and I would be left with. And what follows in Federalist Paper number 29 is an attack on the anti-federalists on this point. Publius says the following in paragraph 3. If standing armies are dangerous to liberty, an efficacious power over the militia in the same body ought, as far as possible, to take away the inducement and the pretext to such unfriendly institutions. So what's neat about this is if that standing army is dangerous to liberty, Publius is not here considering that it's being directed by the federal government. It's actually a standing army being directed by what? Its generals, by the ambitious Caesars within the army, not by the president or the Congress. It's going against the Senate, just like Caesar, is my reading of that section. And so what is the government to do? It's to call out its forces of Pompey. It's to call out its militia. You need the federal government to have this power so it can deal with that standing army if it happens to go rogue and cross the Rubicon. Unless I'm misreading paragraph 3 of Federalist 29, that's what I think Publius is arguing here.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. There was a problem that I was reading, and I think I just explained away, right? If the standing army is dangerous to liberties, why would we think that the nationally controlled militia would be any better? And we read in the sentence previous, if a well-regulated militia be the most natural defense of a free country, and ought certainly to be under the regulation and the disposal of that body which is constituted the guardian of the national security. So again, while recognizing the necessity of the army, we again appeal to the militia as the defense of a free nation. What's interesting about this paper as well is that there are several objections that we deal with, right? There are many different kinds. Publius says that in order to cast an odium upon the power of calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, it has been remarked that there is nowhere any provision in the proposed Constitution for requiring the aid of the posse comitatus to assist the magistrate in the execution of his duty, whence it has been inferred that military force was intended to be his only auxiliary. Posse comitatus. I think the last time I heard that word was from a West Wing episode. It's calling up the boys. It's that Toby Keith song, Beer for My Horses.
I'm glad to tell you. Well, I don't know. I don't have any ill will towards Mr. Keith, but I don't know this tune. I'm sorry.
They call the boys in Texas.
I see. Yeah.
You have a problem. The sheriff needs to be able to call upon the citizenry to enforce the law. The Constitution, the Anti-Federalists say, does not contain within it a provision for the most Republican form of law enforcement.
And what's great about this is how apoplectic Brutus is about the necessary and proper clause in Brutus 1, And you've pointed out, hey, look, Publius is here quoting the Constitution, which he does not often do. And in this argument concerning posse comitatus in paragraph 4, makes reference to the necessary and proper clause and says, well, isn't that my words now, blank check, which he could write to, what did you say, the boys in Texas or whatever? Yeah. Couldn't he do that? That's Publius's argument. Look, we can do this. It's okay.
Yeah, he concludes with it being therefore evident that the supposition of a want of power to require the aid of the posse comitatus is entirely destitute of color. It will follow that the conclusion which has been drawn from it in its application to the authority of the federal government over the militia is as uncandid as it is illogical. What reason could there be to infer that force was intended to be the sole instrument of authority merely because there is a power to make use of it when necessary? And then the stab, what shall we think of the motives which can induce men of sense to reason in this extraordinary manner? How shall we prevent a conflict between charity and conviction? Maybe we can just stop listening. That's how you prevent the conflict. Turn it off. Log off.
So he ends 28 saying that these people won't listen to arguments and won't be persuaded by reason, the people who are against a standing army. And now here in 29 on militias, he turns to the posse comitatus argument and then attacks the motives of the anti-feds and suggests, just stop listening to them. They're not arguing in good faith. Because we, as Publius would have us, are open to reasoning and argumentation, we should be closed off to these dubious bad faith arguments. So he's telling us who to listen to. He's telling us who are our friends and who are our enemies. This is, again, part of Publius's education of his citizenry.
Yeah, and the next objection that he raises is that the anti-federalists are actually mistaking friends and enemies in reference to the militia. By a curious refinement upon the spirit of Republican jealousy, we are even taught to apprehend danger from the militia itself in the hands of the federal government. It is observed that the select corps may be formed, composed of the young and the ardent, who may be rendered subservient to the views of arbitrary power. Now, he says, if I were to deliver my sentiments to a member of the federal legislature on the subject of a militia establishment, I shall hold to him in the substance the following discourse. So, interestingly, I'm not going to call it a dialogue. There is a monologue within this essay. What do you make of the fact that he doesn't just go outright? Why does he cover himself in a way? Well, actually, no, he doesn't cover himself. He puts himself forward.
He puts himself forward, and now what is he doing? He's convincing a member of the federal legislature who you and I have been reminded repeatedly in these 20s papers is our representative.
Mm-hmm.
So he's now trying to show us how he would persuade a representative, and then the question is whether or not we're persuaded of this. So what a remarkable rhetorical technique he's adopted here, that he's not adopted thus far in the paper. He's addressed us. He's addressed certain types of men, candid men, friends of liberty, and so forth. And now he's talking to a legislator because why? That legislator is going to make laws regulating the militia. So this is how it is that he would have even the legislator understand the matter. Publius is moved from educating the citizenry who might vote to ratify this constitution to educating the legislator himself on regulating the militia. It's fascinating that it just pops out here in the middle of Federalist 29 after an admission of the danger of young and ardent people being taken under the spell of some arbitrary power and how it is that that might make the militia especially dangerous for us. It's going to be moderated by the legislature, which is here being moderated by Publius, moderated by receiving the education from Publius. It's absolutely brilliant, I think. And it goes on for 2 paragraphs, paragraphs 6 and 7 of Federalist Paper number 29. Look, we're still having to fend off this concern over the young and ardent who might fill the militia and be under the spell of this arbitrary power, as I said. Paragraph 6, there's a limit to this well-regulated militia. The federal government disciplining the whole can only do so much. And the word here, discipline, like the work you did, Aaron, in helping us understand the word force, here the word discipline, you might think of the word training. Here it's making it a well-regulated militia that's well-trained, well-disciplined. So how ragtag is this thing going to be? How well-disciplined is this thing going to be? He says here to have this militia become sort of expert in martial matters would form an annual deduction from the productive labor of the country to an amount which, calculating upon the present numbers of people, would not fall far short of £1,000,000. To attempt a thing which would abridge the mass of labor and industry to so considerable extent would be unwise, and the experiment, if made, could not succeed because it would not long be endured. We can't afford this, and the people won't put up with it. And then he says, little more can reasonably be aimed at with respect to the people at large than to have them properly armed and equipped, and in order to see that this be not neglected, it will be necessary to assemble them once or twice in the course of a year. So if you recall, when we were in paragraph 6 back in Fed 28, I said, I see the Second Amendment right here, the seeds of it, to be sure. And then we see it again in what I just read to you in paragraph 6 of Federalist 29. And also what I want to point out that Publius is saying now is if you have apprehensions about this well-regulated militia being full of young and ardent people under the spell of some arbitrary power that's going to rob you of your liberty, so they're only coming together once or twice a year. They're only going to be so disciplined. And there's a solid chance you too are armed. So it's not that big of a threat. What's funny to see, it's not that big a threat because it's only so disciplined when we were using the same militia back in Fed 28 to fight against a well-disciplined standing army that's raised in the art of war. He makes the argument he needs to make depending on the counter argument that he's attacking.
And so the solution in the middle path between all of these, he says, is a select corps of moderate size upon such principles as will really fit it for service in case of need. By thus circumscribing the plan, it will be possible to have an excellent body of well-trained militia ready to take the field whenever the defense of the state shall require it. This will not only, ding, 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 lessen the call for military establishments, but if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people, while there is a large body of citizens, little at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens.
There it is.
But should we be afraid of such a force? Publius reminds us again who our friends and who our enemies are. There is something so far-fetched and so extravagant in the idea of danger to liberty from the militia that one is at a loss whether to treat it with gravity or with raillery, meaning laughter, whether to consider it as a mere trial of skill like the paradox of rhetoricians, or a disingenuous artifice to instill prejudices at any price, or as the serious offspring of political fanaticism. Okay, we're building. Why is it so ridiculous or so serious to blame the militia? This is moving, I think. Where in the name of common sense are our fears to end if we may not trust our sons, our brothers, our neighbors, our fellow citizens? What shadow of danger can there be from men who are daily mingling with the rest of their countrymen and who participate with them in the same feelings, sentiments, habits, and interests? Cut myself off and just thinking about our brothers and our neighbors, our fellow citizens, our sons who share the same feelings, sentiments, habits, and interests. What danger could there possibly come from a force raised from our own flesh and blood, either in our family or in our community? It points to, as I said when we were talking about the last paper, the importance of having the body of the armed force being derived from the body of the citizenry at large, but also reminds us that when we were fearing from the beginning, the standing army or the militia, we didn't have much to fear after all. It's interesting to watch this happen over the course of the previous papers, even in this paper that is named something different than the preceding ones. We took very seriously the threat of a tyrannical standing army or a tyrannical militia in the beginning of these conversations. Now we're learning that we actually didn't have much to fear.
Especially when you consider, as Publius does in paragraph 9, that the particular states have the sole and exclusive power of appointment of the officers. When Publius says, what shadow of danger can there possibly be from our sons, our brothers, our neighbors, and our fellow citizens, whom we are actually to trust? You can trust because they make up the officers, the leaders of this militia within the states. It's local. So it looks a whole heck of a lot like what the anti-federalists really like, local, as responsible. But here Publius is using the language of trust. And then now we turn in the 10th paragraph as the rhetoric continues to soar and Publius gets a little bit poetic. In reading many of the publications against the Constitution, he says, a man. I want to point out to you that he now just says a man. He doesn't qualify this man. He's no particular type of man. He's not a friend of liberty. He's not an enlightened friend of liberty. He's no one like this. He's just a man. Look at this, paragraph 10. In reading many of the publications against the Constitution, a man is apt to imagine that he is perusing some ill-written tale or romance, which, instead of natural and agreeable images, exhibits to the mind nothing but frightful and distorted shapes. And then he offers a quote, gorgons, hydras, and chimeras dire, discoloring and disfiguring whatever it represents and transforming everything it touches into a monster. That gorgons, hydras, and chimeras dire is from Milton's Paradise Lost, book 2 of that wonderful, wonderful book by Milton. The Constitution itself, they are making into a monster. They are making this thing into a frightful, seemingly unnatural and evil thing that's going to do harm to you. But it's just imagination, just terrible imagination. It is not an accurate picture of the reality that is the Constitution. Instead, that picture is being relayed, Publius would have us understand, by him here. No matter the way that the militia looks in Federalist Paper number 28, as capable of going toe-to-toe with the standing national army, here in 29, you have to realize, man, it's just your brother and your father and your son. And it only is going to meet once or twice a year. It's not really going to be filled with these ardent, crazy young upstarts who are being controlled by some Caesar. It's not a problem. To worry about it would be to worry about mythical creations from the mind of some anti-Fed. And if you're interested in Publius's use of literature, we've already seen some Shakespeare. Now we're seeing some Milton. Take a look at Federalist Paper number 80 whenever you have a minute to see what's going on there with something similar.
Later, he says, a sample of this is to be observed in the exaggerated and improbable suggestions which have taken place respecting the power of calling for the services of the militia. At one moment, there is to be a large army to lay prostrate the liberties of the people. At another moment, the militia of Virginia are to be dragged from their homes 500 or 600 miles to tame the Republican contumacy of Massachusetts. And that of Massachusetts is to be transported an equal distance to subdue the refractory haughtiness of the aristocratic Virginians. Do the persons who rave at this rate imagine that their art or their eloquence can impose any conceits or absurdities upon the people of America for infallible truths? I would note that haughtiness and contumacy are basically synonyms. So all Americans, whether it's a Republican haughtiness or a Democratic haughtiness, are haughty, at least in Virginia or Massachusetts. I don't know about Marylanders or South Carolinians.
Yeah, the language here is fantastic. He does it again in paragraph 12. Are suppositions of this sort the sober admonitions of discerning patriots to a discerning people, or are they the inflammatory ravings of chagrined incendiaries or distempered enthusiasts? So he keeps it going in this paper. It's really fun. So, hey, what do you know? A paper that's about warfare contains this sort of speech. He's attacked motives in the previous paper. Here he's just using all this wonderful language to call them fools and disingenuous lunatics. It's really a fun paper in this way, while at the same time it's about such a serious matter, as I suggested in my opening remarks. So it seems as if we need these sort of polemics and this sort of rhetoric at the end to fasten ourselves to Publius's argument for a well-regulated militia as a power vested in Congress, and then also the power to raise and keep standing armies as a power vested in Congress, all as a part of the national government, which is to have energy if it is to own up to its ends. Here's the question. Are you convinced?
I am convinced. Although, again, I've been sort of hanging on my concern that the Americans little know their rights and are willing to defend them, or that the standing army is constituted from the great body of an armed citizenry. That should be the security of the people seems reliant on that.
This is a great point you make. So you have to say, so it's one thing for the arguments to be convincing. We today ought not to lose sight of the qualities that the American people are to possess in order for these arguments to function. That's thank you for making that point, Aaron.
Yeah, we can look to these papers and think about what is necessary for self-government. And there are some things that we cannot control that are going to be salutary for us, like the great extent of the territory. I mean, Mr. Mansfield has that great line in the end of his essay about a strong executive where he promises to think long and prayerfully about returning Texas to Mexico. The extent of the country actually is not under our control, but the character of the people in some ways are. And this education from Publius is to remind us of the characteristics that I, Americans, have to have in order to remain self-governing.
And it starts with ourselves. It begins at home, and then echoes out. Yeah.
Just like the Good Government podcast.
What?
It begins at home and echoes out.
Yeah.
So listen, we'll make you a self-governing people.
Yeah.
If you're not,
I'm going to self-govern. I'm going to self-govern myself out of this podcast right now, Aaron.
And I'll do the same thing, but for my own reasons.
Yeah. No, and I respect those, and
you.
it's a matter of conscience on your end, and I'm not even going to inquire into it out of deep respect for your conscience, for your ability to make these decisions as you see fit. Hey, going to start up another Plato reading group this term.
Really?
And I think we're going to read the Pink Book. Roots of Political Philosophy, 10 Forgotten Socratic Dialogues.
Yeah.
Already from the beginning with controversy, because the disputed nature of these dialogues regarding their authenticity, I, of course, think they're all really from the hand of Plato. Beautiful dialogues. I can't wait to read the Hipparchus, Minos, Alcibiades I, Theages, and so on and so forth. The Cleitophon's in there. That's just a couple of little pages. Have you played around much or taken seriously the Pink Book?
Yeah. I actually brought it with me on my trip recently.
Nice.
I was noodling around with it on the plane some of the early days before I realized I didn't actually want to spend much time reading on that trip. I read The Lovers at the recommendation of one of our friends who wrote his master's thesis, a commentary on that dialogue.
Yeah, that's
and the
a great,
essays are excellent
great
too. I mean, that's an incredible volume at giving great translations of these, as the title suggests, forgotten Socratic dialogues with commentary by people whom any serious student of Plato would respect.
Yeah, Greater and Lesser Hippias are in there. It's a fantastic book. I'm not surprised you traveled with it because of its quality. It's a wonderful book. I'm surprised, though, that the size of it found you grabbing it on your way out the door.
It may have been
something
a mistake.
smaller.
I certainly overpacked.
Yeah, that was what was so good about the old Ostwald translation of the Ethics. Small. You'd fit that in a pocket, and bring it places with you really easily if you were traveling light. And since you walked 180 miles or whatever on that trip, surprised you weren't a little more economical in the decisions you made. But maybe that's the point. The beautiful things are difficult, Aaron.
Well, one can only learn he's overpacked after he's done it.
Yeah. Hey, great seeing you.
Yeah,
Love
thanks,
talking about some Federalist Papers with you. On to 30 through 36, which will be about Congress's power to tax and spend money precisely for the military.
Good. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Aaron. See you later.
See ya.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.